afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, yes, my name's Kirsten Riolo and I'm a Research Director here at Ipsos in Australia. This afternoon we're going to talk to the topic of cross-media measurement and specifically around the project that our Ipsos team and the BBC have worked on in the UK for quite some time. In a moment, both these gentlemen, Jim and Jeroen, will talk through the journey that they've taken together, and I'll emphasise together. It has definitely been a scaled conquest of the mountain, but it has been done in partnership, and as an Ipsosian here, very proud of that achievement. The important thing is that this scale has been huge, it's been important, it is single source, it is multi-channel, and it's across platform measurement per se for the assets that they needed to keep track of. The other interesting thing to note, of course, is that it is covering broadcast media of all types and on-device consumption of smartphones, tablets, PCs and laptops. Known as Compass, it's important to see that this is also the involvement of a single attribute. It's not multiple meters, it's not people meters, watches, or pages. Rather, it is actually using the panellists' own interface with their phone, capturing what they're doing in their world. This has meant that we've had solid participation rates, really good levels of engagement, and therefore robust and consistent data over time, which has been super important for the BBC and the requirements they've had from this project. So now it's a chance to look back. With 2 years of data at hand, we're able to see what this journey has looked like, what we have learned, and to provide to you today some key outtakes. So what we're going to quickly go through in a minute is what they set out to do. What were the goals of the project? What were the key aims? How was it set up? What was done? What are the strengths of Compass overall, particularly from the mindset of the BBC? It's lovely being part of this journey, but the ultimate goal is to make sure that for the BBC, this works for them and their business needs. What is it telling us and how is it being used? So with all that in mind, I'd love to hand over now to Jeroen, who's going to talk through some of these details with you, and Jim to top and tail this presentation today. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm Jeroen. So I'll start with a bit of the context of why we set out what we did. So the BBC is not short of valuable data sources to measure the performance of all of our content and all of our services. We participate in a lot of JICs and industry studies, and each of them gives a wealth of data that we think we can only get from those data sources. At the same time, we are in a unique position, in the UK at least, of making content available across radio, TV, online, and also on a lot of third-party platforms, social media content. Nothing is measuring all of our media on all of the platforms across all of the devices, so none of these studies as such can show our audience's interactions in a joined-up way. So the need for that study, because the setup of the BBC isn't new, the need for that study has been around for well over 10 years, and we had a diary-based setup to measure some of those things. That wasn't enough for us, so we started testing passive metering techniques before we started commissioning the study, because we thought the time was right to actually replace the old study by a new study. We set out to use state-of-the-art techniques to design a brand new setup to get a data source to be used both at a strategic level and on a day-to-day operational level. So this is the first time we're presenting this outside of Europe. We have done it in the UK once or twice. So the first question we tend to get, or at least I tend to get after the presentation, is this the BBC saying we're going to pull out of BARB, the TV JIC, and RAJAR, the radio JIC? That's clearly no. We're still very much committed to those studies for the reason I mentioned. Some of those studies can have bigger panels, bigger samples, can go into much more detail. But the aim of Compass is to add a layer on top of it, of those studies. It wants to deliver elements that the currencies can't. It wants to look at our pan-BBC reach, and it overlaps across all of that. So it's a joint approach in that way. But before I'm going to, as Kirsten told you, going to share some of the stuff we can do with it, Jim is going to tell you what it looks like.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a delight to be in Australia for the first time. You can tell that we're new in town. We went out on Sunday without any sunblock on, and by noon we were quite red from just from a nice morning. So what we've actually built is a panel. It's a panel equipped with as much sort of passive measurement technology as possible. It's a large panel. It's 2,900 people, individuals, age 16 plus. It's got to be nationally representative of the UK, and for all those difficult to target groups, we've boosted 16 to 24s. The nations within the UK are still nations at the moment. See what we can do in the next month or so. And then finally, because of the BBC has a public service broadcast remit, we've got to measure sort of BAME audiences and be fully representative of those. What we've done is we've used our software meters to be as passive as we possibly can. So as Jeroen sort of said, we are looking at measuring broadcast technology, TV and radio, sort of on-device consumption, players, audio players, video players, and also there are walled gardens, because we're not just measuring the BBC properties. We want to contextualize that and put it into where they fit with both traditional sort of competitors, but also with the Facebooks, Googles of this world as well, and Spotify's. There are the walled gardens, therefore there's still a requirement to calibrate things by understanding what is happening within these walled gardens and how we can use the data we're collecting to attribute that data efficiently. So we've used our MeasureUp app application, which is the heart of all our measurements and our developments within Ipsos. As I said, it's an app. It's almost an agnostic app, which sits on panelists' own smartphones and turns those smartphones into meters. We can also plug third-party technology into those. So we've used an on-device measurement company, Reality Mind, who I believe are active in Australia. So we've plugged that into the application. And then we're also using that technology to install on panelists additional devices. So when we recruit them, we identify what additional devices they use regularly on a weekly basis, and then we install the additional metering technology onto those, and there's a unique link which links all of those together. We're not looking at any registration at this point, so we are just capturing what's captured on those devices. What we are doing in terms of the audio measurements, we're using standard TV audience measurement techniques. We're using audio matching technologies. So we are measuring 250 TV and radio stations in the UK, both free-to-air and subscription services. We are then taking audio fingerprints of those time-stamped on the device, passively sending that data back to our servers, and a very clever algorithm gives us the measurement of start and end time of consumption of those audio services. For radio, we're measuring and reporting on live, and for TV, we're doing a 7-day time-shifted measurement of all of this. We're also trying to minimise the impact on our panelists completely, but we do need to have a survey-based element. So we have a device agnostic diary, which allows panelists to complete their understanding of what they're doing within those services. We had to set this up and test it all. We're in year 4 of a 5-year contract. When I started, I had black hair. I didn't look like I joined some kind of religious monk order, but it has been a very challenging and delightful journey with a very understanding client. One of the important things that we do is we're using a lot of metadata. We are completely GDPR compliant. That is not a tick box. That's an ongoing review of as interesting to hear. It is an interpretation. We also have an interpretation which the T's and C's, of which our panelists see, have to be understandable, have to be clear. They're not a 300 Apple-based T's and C's where you click through. They have to go through. And we have a triple opt-in. It doesn't sound that interesting, but it is really important. So from the recruitment point, through the installation point, through to the point at which we start receiving the data and whitelisting those, the panelists are fully understanding of what we're doing, how we're anonymizing the data, and how we're using the data that we get from the devices in terms of measuring compliance and participation. It's not a device on is not enough. The device has to be used, and we're using all kinds of metadata from the devices to set those quality thresholds. The challenges. It's fair to say that we sold a vision, and the BBC bought a vision, but we spent time in doing that. So we had to, and it's always good to do a research paper just before lunch. The importance of panel composition, minimizing the bias, identifying the response from different sample sources. The sample is now 60% recruited via online, 40% via offline. Understanding each of those elements, calibrating those, understanding those. We're not measuring the silo media. We're measuring digital consumption, we're measuring radio consumption, we're measuring TV consumption. Having one set of compliance rules will have an impact on each of those. So it's really important to understand the editing rules behind all of that, and how each of those sort of impact the overall consumption and reported numbers that we deliver. To build a diary, to make the diary as minimal in terms of impact as possible. And now the next stage of the process in the next 2 years is to fuse all that data from the diary data back in. So we've got one final single source data set that has the attribution to the sources. So for example, we're collecting data from smart speakers, but that's captured as radio data. We're capturing information from players, but that's considered to be TV data. We're using the diary to reallocate those sources because we are a panel of individuals. We're using umpteen different sets of metadata, and part of I had some interesting sort of conversations with the IAB board yesterday. You know, the detection is hard, but the data management and the sort of cleaning of the data in terms of linking all the metadata sets together is also a challenge. To try and give, for example, the BBC a single measure of the reach and time spent of news, where they're delivering across TV, radio, and their websites and apps. To do that is not an inconsiderable task. And obviously, it's not just news; it's entertainment, it's sport. All of those have to be harmonised across all the different platforms. Finally, we had to put it into a reporting tool. It's great collecting the data. The BBC were already using Kantar's Tech Edge tool, so all the data goes into there on a weekly basis, and they're able to cut and slice that data as and how they wish, limited only by the sample sizes of a 2,900 reporting sample. What we had to do was validate the data. Your run is 1/4 of a technical committee that has to do the equivalent for TV, radio, and online, as well as doing his day job, which is sitting on the technical committees of Barb, Radio, and UCOM. He relaxes by spending time with our technical committee. We had to do the complete validation of the tool to sell it into the stakeholders within the business. So we have a robust data set. It's a flexible data set, but it covers an enormous amount of data, both at a minute by minute level for all of the panelists, what they consume, 365 days of the year. So the first thing we did was start comparing to the industry measures as is. So this is a viewing pattern comparing our data. I think looking at that is well, it doesn't really matter because they're both so close together. So one of them is Barb, which is the household panel data, and the other one is our individual panel data. When we looked at this at a viewing level, at a reach level, at a program level, at a station level, it was incredibly similar. So that was one small bit ticked. Looking at online behaviour, as you know, it's a bit of a Wild West world out there. But the BBC does have access to all kinds of data sources, so we're able to look at numerous different sources to validate the reach and the time spent of these certain platforms and properties within that. And then for radio, radio is also a measure done by Ipsos in the UK, but it's done via a diary. What you find with a comparison for diary versus electronic is that reach tends to be quite similar, but you have a lower level of time spent listening. But it's trying to identify what were the drivers within that, and finding transparent and robust modelling techniques to sort of build that to an acceptable and understandable and robust level for the client. So what does it tell us? I've gone quite fast, but now the more interesting part is going to be done by your own. Sorry.
That's fine. So it tells us quite a bit. In a way, showing simply the added 3 slides Jim showed, the pattern of radio, the pattern of TV, and the pattern of online is no rocket science. But in some ways it is, because this is now all based on one single source database. So we can start actually looking at that single source perspective and look at overlaps. Matt Rowley, in his opening words, talked about non-controversial pan reach for pedestrian. The BBC pan BBC reach is in some ways the main goal of this tool, because we have to report to the general audience, to regulators, to the government, to show to what extent the BBC informs, educates, and entertains the entire UK population. So actually that well over 90% reach is a really important metric for us. So sometimes a bit weird to have all of that work and all of those years reflected in just that one number. But that's part of the game. And hopefully we think it's non-controversial. But at the same time, what we did initially was to do that on a monthly and a weekly level. We can now do this for all sorts of target groups, of course. We can do it on a daily level. We can play around with reach definition, thresholds. So now it's suddenly opening up, apart from that accountability thing, also all sorts of strategic uses. We can look at Venn diagrams and then present them in a slightly different way. This is showing the overlap of the reach used by our audiences on the various media platforms. You can tell this is broadcast and online. You can tell which part of our audiences uses one media platform only. A lot of it is still combined radio and TV, but you also see the growing part in the middle, which is combining all platforms. And we can see different patterns, of course, for different target groups. This is based on a 1-minute definition. We can go up to 15 minutes, which we tend to do for pan BBC reach, but again, we can play around with that. Then we've got a data set that is allowing us to do other things as well. So again, this is not a shocking graph. This is an episode of Strictly Come Dancing, and this is the pattern of that one episode. But because we have the cross-media data set, we can now start looking at what are those audiences in those 1.5 to 2 hours doing at the same time on social media, reflecting the fact that we don't necessarily know whether they are engaging with that program or doing something else, but it is a good indication for a program like this. Is there some engagement or interaction with that program? For some programs, drama series, it's not necessarily key to do that during a show. For entertainment programs like Strictly Come Dancing, is really key to look at and be able to. And we can go even deeper on some of the brands. For radio, as Jim mentioned, in the UK we've got data 4 times a year based on quarters, based on a diary. So although some markets have already transitioned to electronic measurement, for us it's fairly new. So we can look at a one-day event like a Hyde Park concert on Radio 2 and look at what the patterns is during that specific day compared to an average Sunday. And we can see which parts, I'll keep quiet about the morning, perform a bit less than average, and which parts, and you're happy to say that Carly's out there as well, perform better than average. We can look at reach. Looking at the radar data, we usually look at an average weekly reach, because that's what radar measures. For commercial purposes, to track campaigns, you then put a model on top of it to see how the reach builds. We are license fee funded, so that commercial angle isn't necessarily interesting for us. So we don't really look at it. But at the same time, this is showing how big our audience in reality is over the 13 weeks. And this is what we're now doing, not in a modeled way, but in a metered way. So we already have a conversation with Radar, whether that could be used for of use for the industry as well. We can then look at all sorts of overlaps. We can look at overlaps between a radio platform or radio channel and a TV channel. We can look at what the incremental reach is of one of our radio stations within the entire portfolio. Or we can look at talent. Graham Norton is doing a Saturday show on Radio 2 around lunchtime, but he also has his even bigger TV program on the Friday. To what extent is there an overlap? To what extent is there an aimed overlap? To what extent can creative people actually work on that overlap or try to diminish it, whatever is best from their purpose. As Jim said, traditionally we focus on getting the competitive set for radio and TV in, but we can now look at our own pan-BBC reach in the context of, for instance, the Facebook brands combined and the Google brands combined, and reflecting to what some of the other data sets were already seeing, although the BBC's got a really substantial reach for the younger audiences, we need to admit that Facebook and Google on that same metric, with that same definition, are bigger. We can look at those Venn diagrams, not only within our own portfolio, but we can also look at a Venn diagram including other brands. And in some ways, this might be matching the words of Gonzalo Fuentes earlier. This is showing for younger audiences to what extent the overlap in the middle for multiple platforms is the reality of today. On top of it, there is still some single source BBC TV only, or the combination in this case between BBC TV and Facebook, what they do on a weekly basis. So these are some of the more practical things. More on a strategic level, we of course can look at the metrics we already knew: audience sizes, shares, time spent, and reach. Some of the metrics on the right-hand side, the breadth of occasions, funnel analysis, were the type of analysis we already did on digital databases, but we were never able to do any of this across our all of our platforms. So this opens up a conversation within the BBC, and that's a live conversation. Should we look at different metrics? Should we look at metrics in these type of ways? Should we look at funnel analysis, again, which aren't really being used within the radio figures, but we can now suddenly look at radio on a monthly level, weekly level, and daily level, and can do that in exactly the same ways we can do TV where it was possible, and for online. Does it make sense to actually use the same definition when it comes to reach thresholds, or doesn't it? We can do it for a station level or a channel level. It opens up a whole new way of thinking. This is one of the things we're working on right now. To what extent, because we see the global companies eating in on our performance. We can see Netflix, of course, Spotify. So to what extent can we now devise a strategy where the BBC is a value daily habit? To what extent are products like iPlay and BBC Sounds, which we launched early in the year, last year, I forget. But to what extent are they part of the mix, and to what extent do the metrics we use feed into those? So a lot of work, a lot of insights, a lot of words, but we also have a few-minute animation which sort of summarize what we were just saying.
The BBC is in the unique position of making its content available across radio, TV, and online. This content is available on many of its own platforms, as well as our official third-party devices and social media channels. We use a wide range of sources for measuring the media behaviour of our audiences across TV, radio, and online. But there is nothing that joins them all together to measure audience behaviour across the spectrum of BBC services. This leads to questions about our total reach, overlaps, and specific audience groups, as well as single titles, events, or genres. Compass is designed to measure all of our media, on all platforms and on all devices, and as such is able to tell us much more about all of our audience's interactions. So how does Compass work? It's based around a national panel of 2,900 people, fully nationally representative. The panel is mostly recruited online and is administered by Ipsos, one of the UK's largest and most respected research agencies. We've included panel boosts for the nations and for younger audiences. From this panel, we'll collect information on a daily basis for all media they use, leading to weekly reporting of the behaviour we see. Although we've set up a hybrid data collection solution, wherever possible we measure media behaviour passively. In other words, we'll do our best to have minimal reliance on what people tell us and instead focus on electronic measurement using 2 meters, MediaCell and Reality Mine, combined in one mobile app. The meters depend on the smartphone's functionality and run via the app in the background of the user's personal device. Both meters help us track the panel's consumption of radio, TV, online and social media, regardless of whether it is live, on demand or on catch-up. Panel members are also asked to install the Reality Mine software on any other PCs, laptops, tablets or smartphones they use. But we know not everyone uses a smartphone, so we split our sample into those who usually use a smartphone and those who do not. We then provide the latter with a disabled smartphone featuring only the MediaCell functionality. The meters will not capture any online behaviour that takes place on devices that are not owned by panellists, but by their work. We understand that the meters won't capture everything, so we've added a recall-based diary to fill in the gaps where passive measurement currently doesn't work. For example, to measure BBC content on social media such as Facebook or YouTube. Now that we know about what Compass is, what does it tell us? Well, for a start, it enables us to generate a massive database of continuously monitored behaviour by month, by week, or by day, even by hour, and by minute if we want it. This, in turn, unearths a real treasure trove of insights into audiences' behaviour. From this, we're able to create all sorts of dashboards and reports. Compass allows us to track the overall total BBC reach of our content amongst all audiences, and by audience. It allows us to track the overlap in the reach of the media platforms that are being used by BBC services, and again can do this for different socio-demographic groups. Divisions within the BBC are able to use Compass in various ways. For example, we're able to show our television stakeholders the level in which social media apps are being used whilst watching one of our TV channels. For radio, we're able to see listening across the day at a much more granular level than in the radar data. For online, we're able to show the use and frequency of different BBC and non-BBC services during the day. For news, we're able to show the cross-platform use of news content at different moments during a day, both on a typical day and during big news events. We can also show analysis of audience behaviour for all nations and on a macro regions level for England. Across divisions and for particular audiences, we're able to show the patterns of consumption and overlap of multiple services on different media platforms. For example, for BBC 4 and BBC Radio 4, or for BBC 1 and BBC Radio 2. All of this data is meant to drive decisions within the BBC on all kinds of levels, from strategic decisions to daily questions. With Compass, we're able to understand the audience interactions in ways never before possible. To find out more about Compass, head to the Audiences portal via Gateway.